be interesting. This is a book by Parker Palmer called Let Your Life Speak. And there were so many tie-ins to so many other different kinds of ventures or journeys of self-discovery. And so there's a lot of intersections with people's personal stories, perhaps here, and it's perfectly fine to have those conversations. That's part of what he has in his workshops. He's written many books. One thing I wanted to say is that even though the book, of course, like any other book, is written in chapters, there's 5, but really 4 lectures that Dr. Palmer delivered, and then they sewed them together in the first chapter that tries to make them not seamless, but what happens is, like anyone who has taught, you'll see that bring your own flavor to the material. So even though today's lecture is on energy, there's going to be a way I present it. Even though today's lecture is on forces, as an engineer, I'm going to present it this way. There's a common theme to how I teach. There's a common theme to how all of us think. There's a common theme to some of the essences that Parker Palmer speaks of. So I've categorized them in this handout somewhat differently. Some of these points came from all the chapters. So these are the main themes of the book. And like I said, if we get to, there's 5 or 6, if we get to 3, that's fine. But we'll do it together. He has another book called The Hidden Wholeness. Excuse me, the wholeness he speaks of is the soul that is within all of us. So at the center of this discussion, however philosophical it sounds, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about what soul is. Parker Palmer believes there is an individuality to all of us, and I'll be making other metaphors for that individuality. But he calls it hidden because a lot of times we do cover it early in life. We have it early in life, then we cover it, and then we spend part of our later life taking that cover off again. So I would like to start with a piece of a DVD where Parker Palmer is speaking to a workshop about what he envisions soul to be. Then we'll talk a little bit about how people venture to find their inner voice or their soul. Then I'll show another piece of the DVD where he talks about how we have a tendency in our culture, and I think he's talking about American culture predominantly, or Western culture, covering that up, and what we do to discover it again. Some of the things I have here aren't all sung together. I'm not very electronic. Sometimes I can get really animated about things he talks about, but he is like the most placid person. It hurts me. After what he's been through, it's just amazing. So he's trying to define soul here, the definition of
whenever I speak
a metaphor
of soul, I always try to acknowledge the fact that this is one of those words that has to be held very lightly because it points toward history, and it's a mystery for which nobody has the true name or the real story. Every tradition has, I think, a different name for it. In the city, people call it sparkling mind. Buddhists, I call it big self. Self with a capital S. Thomas Merton called it true self. Quakers call it the inner light. And I think all of these are synonyms for the same thing. And what that thing is, no one really knows. The best I can do is to say it's so what a person calls it doesn't matter. since the soul itself is a mystery that nobody has a name for, I think the closest you can come is when you get into a metaphor. And the metaphor that I landed on some time ago, I just found enormously helpful, which is this, that the soul, as I experience it, is very much like a wild animal. On the one hand, a wild animal has the capacity to survive deep, dark places, very difficult places, where there's hardly a wild animal has strength and has resilience, has a kind of wiliness, a kind of knowing about survival that the soul on which everybody knew really tough situations. Something inside me allowed me to keep going. Something inside me kept going. So the soul has this strength. At the same time, just like the wild animal, the soul is also very shy. And we know that if we want to see a wild animal, the last thing that should do is run crashing into the woods, yelling and screaming for it to come out. What we need to do is to walk into the woods quietly, sit at the base of a tree, breathe with the earth for a while, and eventually the thing we seek may put in an appearance. If it does, we may only catch it out of the corner of our eye. But to see something so original, so wild, so natural, so elemental, I think for most of us is never to forget it.
So yeah, there's some really key things he says here. To witness something that is so elemental. So he talks about what is elemental, and again, it seems like it's such very general terms, but what he truly believes, I believe after reading many of his books, is that everybody is born with this sense that he was saying different religious traditions bring with different names: the voice, inner light, true self, authentic self. Quakers also say that of God. There is something in everybody in this room, there's something in everybody in 6.5 billion or 7 billion people on earth that is that of God. And we are born with it. And somehow as children, we have an innate, if it's not a knowingness of it that we can write of and write down and speak of, it's a knowingness that we live. When children, had this discussion with my wife, probably as a husband, I'm saying, I'll get into the kids when their personality comes through. There's something very maternal about any young child, but when their personality comes through. There was some connectedness with me of finding out every parent knows that feeling of how unique their child is, and then maybe by transference, how unique they are. When people lose sight of that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, then when people experience a disconnectedness, sometimes that is the result of losing a sense of who we are and what our worth is. The analogy I like to draw is, what if you had, when you see people who are stamp collectors and coin collectors, they say, well, this is a one-of-a-kind coin, this is worth so much, there's no other coin in the world like it. So imagine the Earth as a collection of 6.5 or 7 billion coins, none of them like the other. then there isn't any one that's worth any more than the other. And so he is trying to say, in a lot of what he does, that we package things in the world. We take this voice, this inner light, the thing that is the soul, the thing that makes you absolutely unique, and he's asking you to let that speak. Let that speak. Let yourself be, if you will, your inner child. And it was interesting this morning in the scriptural readings we hear, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, then I became an adult. And I put away childish things. So perhaps in that world of paradox, where this may be saying there is a time to do that, Parker Palmer talks about how not so late in life, as a matter of fact, early on, probably around the time we're teenagers, we tend to find out what the world is going to reward us for, how the world is going to appreciate us. As Mick Roschke likes to say at Redeemer Lutheran Church, we get involved with appearances, accumulations, and accomplishments. Those are his 3 A's. I mean, the world teaches us this. Even if we try to teach our children otherwise, the world teaches us this the second we walk out the door. And there's nothing wrong with those 3 things. What Parker Palmer says sometimes, though, is there are people for whom the search for that and the ego and the appearance, and he'll call it a mask sometimes, tends to cover who we really are, unless we can marry the two, unless we can marry the things we want to accomplish or the things we'd like to appear as with who we truly are. Now, can the world appreciate that? The world can appreciate a good musician. There's actually many musicians that don't make it in the big time, okay? There are local musicians here. Willie Porter is one of them. And it boggles my mind that Willie Porter isn't on the radio all over the country. But these are the things where I think Willie would tell you if you hear himself. There were people, one time at a concert, he said Paul Simon said his songs had too many words in them. Really good song, but it has too many words in it. And he went home and he was going to try to rewrite it. And then he finally came to the conclusion several hours later that just all these words are necessary. I never forgot that statement. All these words are necessary. So Paul Simon, who he's opening for, tells him too many words. So, you know, if you want to put on a mask, you can say, I'll cut my song down to the 3-minute soundbite. Harry Chapin, who grew up in Long Island, where I did, wouldn't do that. He had a song called W-O-L-D. How long was W-O-L-D? Well, it was like American Pie. It was off the charts on length, and so it didn't get radio time. But Harry Chapin had that groupie following. I was one of them. Okay, my daughter now loves American Pie. Says, why aren't there more songs like this? And well, we live in a soundbite world, so we adapt. And I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But sometimes when we adapt, we can cover up the inner light, the inner voice, that the world may say you can make more money if you will do it a different way, or have a different appearance if you do it a different way. So there's a tendency to, we all have this elemental thing. And the metaphor I like to have is that God is a central light. Even today, there's this notion of, in service, let your light shine when you go out. And light, if you're all familiar with the concept of a prism, put a prism in front of light and it breaks it into the colors of the spectrum. There are colors between the colors of the spectrum, by the way. There are primary colors, and then there are all kinds of combinations of colors. So one of the first things we saw with new computers was, oh, I have 6.5 million colors. But there was one time there were 24 colors. There was a time there were no colors. So you're one of an infinite number of kinds of rays of light that all make up the light of God. So I think not only is this this person is the pure red in the spectrum, or the red, cyan, pink in the spectrum. They're one element of God that nobody else is. Nobody else could be if they tried to be, because that's not their essence. And so Parker Palmer talks about finding your essence. What is your nature? Which piece of the light in the spectrum are you? Because you have something unique to offer. Now, we've all heard the story about how, you want to tell your children they can be all that they can be, but let's focus on getting something that'll pay the bills. So we might do something like that and fit in our nature into something that will pay the bills, and that's understandable. There are people that are out of the mainstream enough where doing that is kind of a violation of what part of the spectrum they are. So Parker Palmer, when he was talking about soul, he was talking about two essences. In the book, he starts by talking about how it's this core of who you are, and later he gets at what he's talking about in this dialogue where he says, you know, I had to draw in this difficult time on something deep down within me. Sometimes when you dig down deep within yourself, you come up with an answer nobody else comes up with. It's the answer that works for you, okay? And yet at the same time, the soul is shy, like he said. And that if you go look for it, if you have managed to cover it up at some part in your life, then to find it again, he recommends several things. One is, again, in that metaphor with the wild beast and the animal, go out into the quiet. You have to go into the quiet. And because there's a place there where you get away from all the noise. Get away from all the noise of the world. And there's an old adage that happiness is like a bird, that if you chase after a butterfly, I think Hawthorne said that, if you chase after it, it flutters away all the time. But if you sit quietly and ponder, it will come and land on your shoulder. There are things like happiness and humility that, I think it was Merton who said it, that if you seek humility, you're not going to find it, that you don't go out and say you're humble. You either are humble. It's something that when you sit down and be yourself, if you're humble, it will become self-evident to people. When you are yourself, it can at some time, if you're in the quietness enough, be self-evident to you that you are who you were meant to be. And to come to some comfort level of that is something that's not always easy for a lot of people. And so, he had mentioned, well, he didn't mention, there's a series of pneuma tapes, they're called. Pneuma is after the Greek for breath, translation of Hebrew ruah for breath, and Rob Bell did a series of these pneuma tapes. I don't know if you've used them here, but there's one called Noise. And he mentioned, was it Bernie Krause was someone who does work with the entertainment industry. He said in 1967, it took 15 hours of outdoors to get 1 hour of uninterrupted noise. Uninterrupted noise meaning nothing man-made, not an airplane, not a car. Okay, so this would just be natural noise. And in the year 2000, it took 2,000 hours of continuous taping to get 1 hour of natural noise. So this is becoming a harder place to go to. A harder place to go to. And Parker Palmer is saying in part of the first part of the book that this soul is who you were meant to be. It's who you were designed to be. In the Jeremiah reading today we saw, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Isaiah 43 says, I have called you by name. I made you in the womb. And I made you to be this part of the spectrum of the light. And let that light shine. It's like the light from no other. When you leave and disconnect from, any one of us disconnects from the rest of us, the light is not the same. The light is not complete. The light is complete when we're all there. And Parker Palmer is saying that this is a journey of discovery for a lot of people to actually know who they were born to be. And this can take a large and tortuous path, and he speaks about that. I think to myself, when I read this book, that it reminds me of a baccalaureate sermon I heard once by a pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. His name was Morris Boyd, and he gave a baccalaureate called The Cost of Ambition. And he told all the graduates, he says, you are who you were created to be, okay? And every minute you spend doing something else is a cost. And ambition drives that. Ambition can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Because if you're too ambitious, it can lead you to do things that maybe you'll regret later. But there's an ambition enough to be that thing you were meant to be. And when you have that ambition, when you see a musician who was born to be a musician doing their thing, when you see a ballet dancer, and he talks about a little girl, he says, and he was a very short man, but vivacious. And he walked up and he says, you know, I asked her grandmother, what did she have? What's her gift? And she said, she's got great feet for the ballet. She said, and then it gets very animated. It wasn't just grandmotherly pride. No, it wasn't. Because you could tell in her voice that this is the gift the child was born with, and she knew it. She knew it when she was 12 years old. And so I used to envy that character in his baccalaureate, because I thought to myself, I didn't know when I was 12 what I wanted to be. I was constantly shaped and formed by forces from the outside as soon as I left my house. And I listened to a lot of those things. And Parker Palmer says, this, you can't feel guilty about that, but we do listen to those things, and people telling me you're good at this and this is what you should become. Okay? It wasn't until years later that I learned to hike and go off in the woods and say to myself, who am I? And have to go back and talk to a child that remembered what it was like not to ask the world what you should be, that you had good feet for the ballet, but you had something that you knew as a child that you were, I don't want to say better at than everyone, but different from everyone else, different from anyone else at what you had done, because it is the thing you were sown and made in the womb to be. This is what I think Parker Palmer means soul is. And if you don't think you're that different from everybody else, like Mother Teresa said, can we all do great things? Maybe none of us can do great things. All of us can do little things with great love. All of us can do one thing. If people will tell you who eat my mom's meatballs, there is no other meatballs like it in the world. Lorna will not allow the plate to go near the sink until every piece of sauce is scraped off. And she has absolutely refused to admit that these are, was she born for meatballs? No, I don't want to. But there are people who come to our house and say, you've had 3, I've only had 2.5. They count them. They count them. And in an Italian way, she'll stand there, and if there's 100 of them in a bowl, and they all get eaten, she says, oh, I didn't make enough. But if one is left, she goes, I guess nobody liked them. But people remember how many they've had. There's an element to people that when they're gone, I remember one, my best friend from college, when they were having like a living funeral for his mother. And she's lived many years since that time. But they all got up and spoke wonderful things about her that she never realized the rest of the world saw in her. And she was in tears at the end. And this is another element of soul that's so true. If we let it get mirrored in other people can sometimes see what it is, what gift we have, that we ourselves are either reticent to admit or we're not quite so sure of ourselves. But one of the greatest means of discernment is to let the people around you, when they tell you something that you're good at, to listen to that. Not to necessarily get boastful about it, but to listen to that, because that is truly one of the ways God shows you which piece of the spectrum of the light you are, is to reflect it back and say, look, it's like no other. When you're not in the room isn't the same. And that's true of everybody in this room. When one of you isn't in this room, the dynamic is different. How can I say? I don't know. It always changes. Okay? So this is an essence of what he's getting at with soul. And sometimes if we lose that sense, we have to go off into the quiet. We have to go into where they say God is in the thin places. And Rob Bell speaks about, in this Pneumatate Noise, he says Elijah goes up to the mountaintop, right? And then there's fire, and I don't know, I'm not a scriptural scholar, but there's a fire, and then there's an earthquake, and then there is the still, small voice of God. And I love the way Rob Bell describes these. He says, God, he goes up, and Elijah realizes God is not in the fire. This is his interpretation. God, he goes to the earthquake, and God is not in the earthquake. And then comes the silence. And then the whole tape blanks out. You think it's broken. And it goes on, and then there's just words that come on the screen. Silence, quiet. There's a great book on the New York Times bestseller now, Quiet, Why Introspective People Are Not Appreciated in Our Culture. And I understand. There's something about, there was a New York Times op-ed saying, do you have to be a gregarious leader? And it had Obama next to Clinton and talking about the difference. One is this guy that likes to go home at night and read books and write letters, and the other guy wants to be talking to everybody all the time. Do you have to be gregarious to be a leader? Do you have to be an extrovert? Well, all these things are all separate discussions, but when you're alone, sometimes you have to be at least, not lonely, but alone to see who you are, to remind yourself who you are, and to go out in the world and not be afraid to be that very special, singularly unique thing. Another thing Maurice Boyd talks about is, he gave a great sermon one time where he says, Timothy was born and we gave him all the love that we have, every little atom and particle. He says, and then MC was born, and he goes, and I said, what am I going to do? I've given all my love to the first little guy, And he goes, well, MC came along and she created all her own love. every little atom and every little particle. And then Liam came along. What the heck was I supposed to do now with 3 of them? And he's got 5 children. So he goes on to say something dramatic to me. I don't love my children equally. I love my children uniquely. Okay. There was a quote I was thinking of when Pastor Mankey was talking about at the congregational meeting last week, when they say, give, but give according to your means. And this was actually in the movie Sicko by Michael Moore, and there was a French doctor who couldn't understand the American means of healthcare. And he got up and he finally says, you know, how do we get it? We got to get it. He goes, we give according to our means, and we take according to our needs. And so your way of being in the world is a way to do that. Frederick Buechner has one of those wonderful quotes, when your great love, right, meets the world's great need. What is your great love? That's your authentic self. That's that of God. When you're that of God, for every that of God you've got, that's one little bump in the jigsaw, and there's a place as a whole that it fits it. You are needed somewhere. There is a piece of the world that needs who you are. And that's why it's important that you find out who you are, because otherwise that need does not get met. When Pastor Mankey spoke this morning about community, I wrote on the very bottom of page 1, almost at the bottom, it says, it's not right. Sorry, bottom of page 2. I'm going to skip around. I wrote this days ago, so it's interesting. It's talking about how it's, what was it, ants and cockroaches? Yeah, all about the social community of ants and cockroaches. They know exactly how to treat each other. But human beings, being of free will, are perhaps the only creature on earth to fight their God-given nature. The lion and the tiger, the beast he's referring to here, knows what he or she is. It knows its nature. It doesn't fight its nature. The ants and the cockroaches don't fight their nature. They let their life speak. Now, we have a tremendous caretaking role on this earth and a tremendous way of relating in the world, and free will is also God's gift to us. But it's possible then for us to not use our real nature. And this is where he says, you know, again, we can cover it up with a lot of influences from the world. And so what is this? What is the soul again that we tend to cover it up? What's another word he calls for it? And he says that he keeps coming back to the word the nature. Okay, the nature of who you are. And when I was talking about Willie Porter said something to me once. He said, and it's on the middle of page 1. He said, "Did you ever feel while learning something that's more like remembering something that you've always known?" He's told Lorna how he writes a song. He writes circles, and he has themes in the song that come on this center theme, but then there are various aspects of it. One is called The Language of Letting Go, and in The Language of Letting Go, he has a great line, "Pain comes too quick and wisdom comes too slow." And he talks about unconditional love and all these examples of unconditional love. Someone dying, reaching out to God, or a son, a daughter sitting on a mother's lap on a train to New York City. And when I asked him, how do you get these images? Where do these images come from? And it's just like, he's so spiritual on this level. And he says, it's as if I'm remembering them. They were part of my memory. There's a book called The Scientist in the Crib and How We Learn About Learning. And the scientists from UC Berkeley say that we're not born as an empty slate. A lot of us were given that concept, but we're not born as an empty slate. We're born as a part of that spectrum. We have certain things impregnated within us. Some people have an ear for music. Other people have a tremendous compassion. Other people have tremendous empathy. And like it says in 1 Corinthians 12, right before the verses we had this week, all the lessons of the parts of the body. I mean, that's probably if I have a favorite part of the Bible, that's got to be it, where you're a kidney, you're a spleen, you're a foot. What if the eye thought that nothing else was important but the eye? And there's lots of bawdy jokes on this end too, but especially to the part where Scripture says there are parts of yourself that are considered the not so showable parts, right? But we give them special reverence. So what is it? We're different. We're all different, and the thing is to take a pride and a joy in that, or when we get too far away from it, every once in a while to go off alone and rediscover it. And again, if you're someone like say Willie, for instance, you're going to play those songs, even if Paul Simon thinks they have too many words. And you're going to tell that story, and you're going to be happy about it because you said, this is my light, and I'm going to let it shine. Now, here's somebody that I know as an example for me. He's a model for me because he knows his nature. He knows his nature. And Parker Palmer says if you have something, you have to, the engineers, he spoke to me here, an engineer has to honor the nature of the material they work with. Okay, so steel has a nature. In graduate school, I studied steel. And it's crystalline nature and polycrystalline nature. And boy, there's equations. I can put you to sleep in 3 seconds. This is great for kids at night. Read them. And I actually, at the end of graduate school, realized the utility of what I had done was nearly microscopic. So I knew an awful lot about almost nothing. But I knew about the nature of steel. I knew one essence of the nature of steel. I met George Krauss, who's a famous elder statesman at Colorado School of Mines, who taught about steel. It was the Bible itself, steel, it's called. There isn't anything about steel that you can't learn from George Krauss. And George said, yeah, you do know a little bit more than me about almost nothing. And it's very humbling. But there is this nature to steel. It's what's called ductile. When you pull it, it doesn't just snap and break apart. It tends to stretch like silly putty. If you get it to 7/10 of its melt temperature, it tends to pull like goop, okay? And when you break it, it has a cup cone failure and everything about it. You can see people that say, let me see that derailleur. The derailleur just sent me off my bike in Ithaca, New York. And there's somebody I'm thinking, seeing if I'm okay. No, he grabbed the derailleur because I want to see what kind of fracture this is. Well, it was inherent to the nature of steel. And he thought it was fantastic. Well, we wouldn't make such a thing out of wood. Why? We make things out of wood because we use wood's nature to our advantage. And the nature of something has potential, he speaks of in the book, and limits. So the potential of wood is that it's fibrous, that it's pliable, that it's much stronger in one direction than another direction. Anyone who's worked with wood will tell you with the grain and against the grain, okay, for a lot of strength reasons. Polycrystalline materials have different strength in different directions. They make the aluminum or the titanium or the steel almost look wood-like. For the purposes of building an airplane wing, you want them stiff this way, but you want them to twist. We can actually tailor materials now. They're called tailored materials, but we're kind of messing with the laws of physics, but we can't. You can't violate the laws of physics. Scotty said it on Star Trek. Richard Feynman told all his students before he won his Nobel Prize, you just can't change the laws of physics. You have to honor the nature of something, and you're no different. You're no different than an atom of steel. You're no different than a fiber of wood. One of you is a piece of wood, one of you is a piece of steel. And trust me, if steel likes to say I'm stronger than you, well, there are times you need to bend more. Trees are not made of steel for a reason.
Industry that built the Titanic in today's steel, it wouldn't have sunk.
It wouldn't have sunk.
Correct.
Right.
It wouldn't have fractured like the old steel did.
Right, right. And they've learned a lot about, and there's, in the area I worked in before I came here, there are people that forged steel, very high-strength steel. And it truly is an art. It's like being a chef, a master chef. And when this father and his sons retired, they couldn't make these structures anymore. So they brought them out of retirement and said, we need you to make 15 more, because we can't find anybody who can do it. Now, you can't believe that this secret of steel only lives with this father and his 3 sons. But with regard to this one particular thing they were making, yes, they knew nobody else they knew of could make the magic. And then there's a processing. It's like baking. It's like making those meatballs. Is this true? I have stood right by this woman and done everything she did, and then had a blind taste test, and nobody would want to eat mine. This is absolutely true. The steel is different. And what can I say? There's also things that we make today that are not as good as things that were made in 1912. And I can tell you there's things about steel that are true like that. So the thing is, we do this all the time. We honor the nature of something. We use it for what it's good for. And, here's one of the things. Mick Roschke likes to say, and I know I've written lots of things in here, Parker Palmer says, God is the source of what is rather than what ought to be. We don't try to do something with steel that it can't do. We use it for what it's good for. I was just finished Wednesday night, a couple weeks ago, we did baptism, talking about how the earthly element of baptism is water. And I asked the girls, I said, do you know what happens to steel when you cool it off, cool it down? And we got to this point eventually, it shrinks. When you take wood and you cool it down, it shrinks. When you take molybdenum and you cool it down, it shrinks. When you take your clothes and you cool them down, they shrink. There's only one thing that we know of in the universe that when you cool it down, it expands. There's only one, and that's water. Water expands. Ice cubes are larger than the volume of water they would fill when they melt. Big whoop. No, yeah, big whoop. Big whoop, because without water expanding when it freezes, no mountains would erode. Without water freezing and expanding upon its freezing, many of the things that led to evolution in the world would never have occurred. Life as we know it on Earth would not be the same if water reduced its volume when it froze instead of expanded. And it's the only compound. You can't find another that does it. You honor its nature. Its nature created the world the way it is. As unknown as that is to many people, its nature is so different. So water is important for a lot of reasons. But seldom do we count that reason that it happens to be the only character who gets bigger when he's colder. What? Why? Why is this? I ask myself. I marvel. To me, that's the language of God. That's the language of God. That is that of God for water, if not for all these other reasons. And there's that piece of you. There's a piece of every one of you that expands when it gets colder, that where everyone else shrinks. And that's what Parker Palmer says is almost your duty. Today when Pastor Mankey talked about community, Parker Palmer has a section of the book where he says, if you don't find your gift and you don't use it, then like Frederick Buechner said, your great joy can't fill the great need in the world. So other people suffer. It sounds harsh. It's like if you don't if Willie doesn't sing those songs with too many words, people suffer because they don't get to hear them. Now I believe that. Paul Simon probably doesn't. But you know, Paul Simon's very successful. Give him that. But I don't want to trade Willie Porter in the world. Sorry, I don't want to do that. I want to, that's a great thing about an iPod. I got Paul Simon on there, but Willie Porter, he comes before us. So there's this finding your nature. That's an interesting notion that he says again and again. First of all, there are limits and potential. Steel, wood, composites, and ceramics. Ceramic tiles covered the space shuttle, right? A wonder that we did not have at the time of the Titanic, to know how to make ceramic tiles. Ceramic tiles are tremendous insulators. They can be very, very hot on the outside, and 3/4 of an inch later have temperature on the inside. It's fine. This was what was unfortunate in the second shuttle disaster, because there was a crack in one of those tiles, and a seething sword of fire went through, and that was the end of that. But when they're pristine condition, they're tremendous insulators. But if you drop one on the floor from a height of a foot, they shatter. They're not ductile like steel. They're extremely brittle. They're like glass, but much more brittle than glass. So you have to treat these things with some tenderness because their strength, their potential, has with it an inherent weakness. And so if you have that inherent, if they get hit by a little piece of ice on blast off and they crack, nobody comes home. And that was a reality. And for whatever we did, we didn't have to cover it up. It could have just happened without us knowing about it. When you violate your nature, eventually you will fail. Now, do I mean God means for you to fail? Well, sometimes Parker Palmer has said, I think God does intend for us to fail when we violate our nature, because he wants you to be that thing you were made in the womb. And if he wants you to be that thing, then he speaks about something like way closing. The Quakers have an expression, gotta get it right. It's on the 3rd page. It says, have faith and way will open. So have faith and way will open. Way is maybe this notion of going to where you should be, going to where you came from, going to your nature. Have faith and way will open. Way for you to be who you are. And Parker Palmer said something that, I'll repeat it again, that we spend the first part of our lives, if I didn't say this earlier, we spend the first part of our lives ignoring, hiding from, moving away from our nature. If that happens. Now, if you're the 12-year-old ballerina and you found it, you found it. But some of the rest of us have reason, and I've done this tremendously myself. I have fought against what it was that was my nature. Only recently have I kind of discovered more of what my nature is like. I hide, I flee, I squander it. I squander some of the talent I've had. And then he's at the Quaker Institute, where he was only going to spend 6 months, but he spent 15 years and became a Quaker. And he said a 60-year-old Quaker came up to him, Ruth, And Ruth said, well, he said, well, I don't have time for this. You know, the clock is ticking, and I haven't found my nature. He goes, way is not opening in front of me. And so Ruth hit him on the shoulders and said, sit down. Because in 60 plus years of life, way has never opened in front of me. But Sonny, a lot of way has closed behind me. And he said it made all the difference. A lot of way has closed behind me. A lot of way has closed behind steel and wood and water. Okay? You're right. Had we built the Titanic out of today's steel, it wouldn't have sunk. Had we done several other things, it wouldn't have sunk. Okay? But what did we have to do? We had to make a mistake first, or we had to live on the edge first. We had to try something that didn't work, and then say, that way isn't working. So what? What does repent mean? That doesn't always have to mean you're sorry. You turn around. Way closing behind you says, this is not the way of the tiger. The way of the ant and the cockroach is that way. And again, we sometimes have to have God behind us closing way to say, this isn't your nature. This is not your nature. Your nature is to be something else. Now, maybe if you're like Willie and you realize there's too many words, and maybe you've already had way closed behind you because you're not going to get to open for Paul Simon again, right? Too many words. But you've chosen to turn, you're going the right way. He could turn around and choose to cut words out of his song. That's not an example of way closing behind him. Way closing behind him is when he's doing what he's doing isn't working. And he has to turn around and do it the way he was intended to do it. Now, does this mean that God is too fantastic for this? Life is not predestined, I don't believe. There's so many ways we can go forward. There's so many ways we can find when way closes to turn around and go the other way. And that's what free will buys us, that maybe the ants and the cockroaches don't have. I don't know. I don't know enough. I told Lauren I was at a conference once when I was dating her, and I said, you know, I'm sure God is looking down at these people talking about string theory, which I cannot understand, no matter how many books I read about it. It says, aren't they cute? Aren't they just the cutest things? They've figured out how to tie those strings, like this kid tying the shoelaces. To God, this is all easy stuff. We hand out Nobel Prizes for it. This is easy stuff. And he's saying in all of us, it's not easy necessarily to know what your purpose is. And he didn't say it would be, but he does say there's a purpose. And every minute you spend looking for it it's a minute not wasted. Absolutely not wasted to find your nature. Now, if you're not in your nature right now, if what you're doing, and you don't have to do it for your work. Now, he never preaches that. You don't have to do it for your work. This is going to be the thing you do at church. It can be the thing you do in your volunteer work. It can be the thing you do in life that's not what brings the money home. It doesn't have to be your work. If it can be, it's wonderful. Willie had to make that decision at some point that this was going to pay the bills. And then he has to write some songs they can play on the radio if he's got to pay the bills. So they can't all be Harry Chapin songs. So somehow there is a way to find your nature by both way opening in front of you, as it did for the 12-year-old ballerina, and maybe for those of us like me who said, no, they said I was good at math and science, I should be an engineer. Okay? So I can tell you, do I have regrets? I don't think I have really, really strong ones, so I'm very fortunate. But I'll use myself just as an example once, and that's twice now. I became an engineer, but the more I stay in engineering, the more I realize I'm not an engineer. I'm an applied mathematician, wherever that's worth. I like doing the math. Parker Palmer says on the front page or second page, what does he say he is? He says in the limits on the what is my nature on the second page. I've written gravity. These are just the ideas we can throw out. Building on others' discoveries versus tinkering in my garage. He starts talking about these paradoxes. People that are good at A are good at B. I was told by professors that I was really good at building off the ideas of others. But I was lousy at coming up with original ideas myself. So I was feeling really good when it was whack-a-mole. So then I thought to myself, so I'm not good at that. And I felt really bad when I left his office. But now I don't feel bad at all. It's not my nature. My nature is being able to take what someone else does and explain it to other people relatively well, at least in the sciences. I can do that. I can make something complex, simple, which I always thought is an easy thing to do. But other people don't find that an easy thing to do. I cannot write music. I cannot sing. at the place where Morris Boyd gave those great sermons to me, I used to be in the all-volunteer choir, but I was asked to leave. All-volunteer choir. The only one at Cornell University ever asked to leave an all-volunteer choir. And the words they said to me were, "You could hand out bulletins." So I derobed, and in shame, I left, but I know that's not my gift. That was way closing very much behind me. That's not going to be something I could do, okay? And I can force that. And here's the thing. He says you can force, the world sometimes does it. Tries to force, I'm a square peg, there's a round hole. And if I try to fit it, what's going to happen is my four corners are going to shear off. But they're part of my spectrum of light. They're part of my spectrum of light. I have these nice, sharp, 90-degree corners. Okay? Now, you can argue there are other people that have them, fine, but we don't fit in circular holes. So what happens when you try to put us in circular holes? We get hurt. You can try to put, and that's where my quote is, you can put a square peg in a round hole, but it hurts. And it denies the nature of the square peg. Okay? So there are a lot of things my wife can tell you ad nauseum, that I'm, that the school I work at is a round hole and I'm a square peg. I don't fit in a lot of ways. In a lot of other ways I do. There's a lot of roundness that I can accommodate to, but there's others that I can't. Okay? And so in those places I'm very alone because I'm comfortable in my nature now, but I wasn't for a while. And then Parker Palmer does talk about something very serious that I have experienced, and that's clinical depression. When you try to shove that square peg in that round hole and you push it, it hurts. It hurts. And so you have such a desire to accommodate, and I did. I wanted to make my parents, we want to make our parents proud, we want to make our mentors proud, we want to look successful in the world. We want those accumulations, appearances, and so forth. And so I had this tremendous ego, and I don't mind saying it, I had this tremendous ego, and I was not being successful. That ego was being damaged big time, and it was breaking through that ego. That is a hard process. Now, if you work on yourself constantly, maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe if you find out your gift when you're 12 years old, you don't have to go through that. But what happened to me was twice in my life, both work-related, my self-worth went to an absolute, what felt like zero. Okay? I dissociated myself from the world, which is characteristic of clinical depression. Parker Palmer had very similar things happen to him. It sounds to me from the reading as if his were worse than mine. Now, there are chemical imbalance forms of depression. There's also what he calls situational clinical depression, which is more like what I had, which is, somebody wants you to be something, and it seems at some point that I actually believed everybody wanted me to be the round hole, and there was no square hole for me. And so he actually says, and this is hard for some people to accept, but I do believe it, that when way closing behind you hasn't worked, then maybe he says, I had to have been thrown into the deep depths of depression. I had to be thrown into that forest, the animal that I am, to go find my soul. I had to be disconnected. Your circumstances, physically, this depression, physically, and he says this depression is the ultimate form of disconnection. That he felt that there was a spiritual reason why he became depressed, that he had to, and in his case, when we say violate our nature, he talks about how there are ways to find soul, and maybe I should address that just real quickly. It says, there's a section called Ask Me What Mistakes I've Made, and he says, there's a tortuous path for many of us to finding our soul. And he tried to, at one time, be a university president. He worked in administration. He tried to work through the academy as an academic. He found out that this was at odds with who he truly was inside. There was so much friction. And he only discovered that when he went to the Quaker Institute. And then he found, through a lot of self-introspection at the Quaker Institute, where he had had many jobs before that just didn't fit. He discovered two things. I had to be away enough to realize my way in the academic world was from the outside. So he gives seminars all over the world now, people in academic institutions. He gives them advice about how there's one of the greatest books I've ever read called The Courage to Teach. I mean, I make it a template for everything I do now because it just feels so holistic. it tells you as a teacher to be who you really are and then to give that to students. He couldn't do this from inside the academy. The academy, and I guess in my limited experience with it in 13, 15 years, or all my grad school years too, this is not built for that. It's not built for a soul as tender as his. And so he found a way, but it was a long, tortuous path. So not all of us get to be the ballerina who find our gift at 12 years old. And so when in the section called Ask Me What Mistakes I've Made, I won't show it, but there's not enough time. There's a great movie called The Big Kahuna that Kevin Spacey produced and never got much airtime, but it's based on a T.S. Eliot play called Cocktail Party. And they're just three characters. They're industrial lubricant salesmen who are in Wichita, Kansas at a conference. And they're just there to sell industrial lubricants. So that's just the backdrop, okay? That's the fact. That's like modern Shakespeare in the park, you know, we bring it all up to date. But what T.S. Eliot, if you get the Cliff Notes version, I guess, they'll tell you that these three characters are the same person at three ages in their life. And that's what fascinated me, is the older salesman, the middle-aged salesman, and the younger salesman. And they have all the facets. The younger salesman is wet behind the ears, he doesn't get everything, he speaks his mind openly, freely, doesn't hide anything. The middle-aged salesman's got a tremendous success record. The older salesman is now thinking, did I do everything? Would I do everything the same way if I had it to do over? And he tells the young guy, he says, you know, you said to me once if you had character, and he goes, I don't think you do, Bob. So the young guy feels really ashamed. Like, I was ashamed when someone told me you don't come up with original ideas. He said, but here's the deal. He goes, you have no character, and I don't know, that's a rather strong statement, but you have no character only because you don't have any regrets. And the young character says, you mean I won't have character unless I do something I regret? Just Danny DeVito, he has this great look on his face. He says, oh no, Bob, you've done plenty of things today. You have no idea what they are. So you haven't been to that stage of introspection, going out in the woods and saying to yourself, oh, I see the folly. Because it's when you see the folly in something you've done, you wish that you could have it to do over. When I see the folly of where I went to school, and those are all good things, but they were way closing behind me. When I see the folly in them, that I listen to people, and I could have taken another route. I might have taken the right route. I can still say that way close behind me, but God blessed me with seeing other things along the way. That's still fine. Okay? Mick Roschke says that we're all broken and blessed. We all have these limits and potentials. But the idea is the young guy goes off to his own room like, forgive me if I respectfully disagree, he says. Of course you can respectfully disagree. It's not until you hit that way closing that you yourself turn around. That's a very, very personal decision. Okay? So sometimes you have to take this tortuous path, and I love this other quote from Parker Palmer, that the ground is where you're grounded. When you say I want to be grounded, right? Hummus, the word hummus, he says when he talks about the seasons, is the root of the word humility. You become humble when you're brought back to the ground, and the way to the ground is all the way down. Our egos are like big balloons. They can float us up here. But sometimes the finger of God has to go and push you down to where you're grounded. And I had a pastor in the church I was previously in who said, you know, when you go to lunchroom, if you want to find Jesus, go in the corner with that guy who's eating all by himself. Go with the kid who's just left the lunchroom because he's crying because something has happened to him. That's where Jesus is. Jesus is not front and center all the time. And so sometimes for us, there are those places. There are those places where we feel like those depths of depression have gripped us. And he says, well, that's pushing you down so you can hit the ground. And when you hit the ground, the only way back is up. So he says the way to God is not up, but down. When you are down, and I was ultimately disconnected from the world. Warner said to me at one point, go out for a walk. You need to go out for a walk. And that's what they tell you to do. People with depression, get them out in the sunlight. So I did. And there's this story I tell my kids, and I'll never stop telling it, that one street was closed, another street was closed. I walked downtown Tosa, came to the old heating store behind the ice cream shop, and I bent down to tie my boots because they had come untied. Now, I understand I've been out of work for 6 weeks. I'm feeling completely alone in the world, even from my family. And I bend over, and I'm breathing heavily as I tie the boot, and so I've breathed on this piece of glass in front of the store, and I wiped it off, and there's a chalkboard behind it. And written on the chalkboard, it says, "You can see me when it's cold, but not when it's hot. You need me to live, take your last and you're not. You see me when it's cold, not when it's hot. You need me to live, take your last and you're not."
Breath.
Your breath. I had just breathed on the window, so I gave myself the answer. Now, this may seem small to some people, or just not, but it just turned me around. Now, I don't know if I got better from that moment on, but I wrote it down on the back of just a piece of junk, and I had to write it down. I would have written down on my arm if I had to. And I said, God is speaking to me. The Spirit, you need the Spirit. You need to be who you are to live. There's no other way. So don't worry about what they're saying about what you're doing. Don't worry that there's too many words in the song. Sing your song anyway. It's your breath. Breath is pneuma, ruah, breath. And so when God picked up the dirt, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But when he breathes the breath of life into you, you become one of those infinite pieces of light in the spectrum. So unique. But I had to be brought to the lowest place to see that. I've experienced that. Probably not as low as Parker Palmer, but I can relate to what he's saying. And if it hasn't been depression, there are other ways I'm sure that people can testify to where way closed behind them. And you ask, why? Why didn't the money come through? Why didn't I get accepted there? Why is it this guy who's so successful thinks my songs have too many words? It's not easy to accept way closing behind you, but it does help to turn people around. So I've hit on a lot of these. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. If people have, there's more in the book, but I think we have to get ready for service. And if there's any questions people have. Yeah.
So if our natures, our potential, and our limitations, one of the things people talk about when they find who they are is those limitations.
Yeah.
And then sometimes people use that as an excuse. Well, I'm just not, I'm kind of an obnoxious personality, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's my nature.
Yeah.
What do you do on the limitation side of who you find you are?
Good question. This had something to do with why I had to leave work for a while. I worked with some people who, other people were telling me they're very passionate, but they were obnoxious as all get out to me. Made my life very, very difficult. But now that I'm back, I see, what I do is just, I try to see what the good things are that they have. And this person's very passionate about their work. But to the point where he says, anybody who doesn't do it my way is wrong. And so they're very, very obnoxious. I don't mind saying that. But at the same time, what he does really well. He just hasn't realized how obnoxious he is to everybody else. He doesn't realize how much power he's sucking out of everyone else. And it's probably not right to say that. There is a whole list of further reading here. I ended up reading a book, pardon the title, The No Asshole book.
Oh, it was wonderful.
It's a wonderful book because it helped me to accept this person somewhat for who they are. But not to say that I think, oh my gosh, if my children acted that way, I'd say, you can't act this way in the world. You're sucking other people's energy up. You shouldn't be doing that. That's not the way to be. But it is a limit on one side, but his potential is also so good that I don't want to lose that. So I can now, before, I just couldn't accept it. And I would talk about it ad nauseum. When his evaluation would come up, I would say, this guy's really got to go. But now I say to myself, people saying, why aren't you saying that anymore? And I say, because we do need some of what he has to offer. And people told me that before and I didn't hear it. But do I wish that he would change in the world? I mean, in a couple of weeks, you're going to hear David Howell here, who's from MSLE. He's going to speak about being the Pieper Chair of Servant Leadership. They asked the head of the Pieper Power Company, what is it about bosses and that create in their job and workspace this concept of servant leadership? And David's going to talk about that, I think, on February 17th. And he said, it also stuck with me. Like, I'll never forget it. He says there is an individual circumstance in their life that led them to realize that their whole company, like everyone in Pieper Power he said, upon being asked, right in their chair, I can tell you what the mission statement of Pieper Power is. I can tell you at MSOB that people can't do that. Okay, what's our mission statement? Well, if we have one and it means anything, we all should be able to recite it. Lori Beth Jones said if you had a mission statement, it ought to be something you can repeat at the point of a gun, a 12-year-old can remember, and you can say in less than 30 seconds. Okay, so, now, again, he said that every one of these servant leaders who led their company that way, he leads his company that way, Southwest Airlines leads their company that way, they claim the Home Depot leads their company that way. They had a circumstance in their life that turned them around. And so my colleague hasn't had that circumstance yet. He hasn't been brought to the brink, he was almost brought to the brink of being fired. This would be the 4th school he was at, and we're going, you know, hey, what does this tell you? You know, this has been going on and on and on, and yet I think he's actually coming to that point where he's softening, and I don't know what to do with that. We deal with people's limitations and we try to use their strengths. If their limitations destroy too much of the people around them, then we probably have to do something about it until they come to that realization themselves.
I had to chuckle when you were talking, because you probably have heard the story about the body parts that wanted to be in charge.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the one I didn't want to tell.
Yeah.
You want to tell it? Go ahead, because I love it. Go ahead. Who says it in the end?
The brain says it should be in charge because it does all the thinking, does all the reasoning for the body, and keeps the body from doing something it shouldn't be doing. And the eyes said, no, they should be in charge because they see everything and see danger before and people. And then the hands say, no, the hands should be in charge because we feed the body and we do the work that keeps the body going. And the feet said, no, we should be in charge because we take the body wherever it needs to go, here, there, and everywhere, and keep it mobile. And then the rear, the whole said, no, it should be in charge. And all the other body parts laughed. They thought that was, and then it closed itself off. Pretty soon the brain started to swell up. The eyes couldn't focus, the hands trembled at the body's side, and the feet stumbled, and finally they agreed it should be in charge. So the moral of the story is any asshole can be in charge.
Maybe we shouldn't try to be in charge. We ought not to dismiss the asshole because he serves a purpose.
That's how you're supposed to turn the other cheek.
And that's a wrap.
Mom,